This episode of the Media Leader podcast was edited by our production partner, Trisonic. And if you're looking for podcast production support, we highly recommend them. Find them at trisonic.co.uk.
We cannot have a functioning democracy without truth, and we're about to lose that. In fact, we have lost that for many demographics who only receive their news and information online.
Welcome to the Media Leader podcast. I'm Jack Benjamin. In March, Meta and Google were found liable by a Los Angeles jury for a woman's harmful social media addiction. Both tech giants were found to have deliberately designed their platforms to be addictive in a way that was demonstrably harmful to the plaintiff, a 20-year-old woman known as Kaley. TikTok and Snap were also previously defendants in the case before agreeing to a settlement ahead of the trial. Meta and Google intend to appeal the decision. The news occurred as political leaders around the world, including here in the UK, have implemented or are considering implementing a ban on social media access for those under the age of 16. It also came after Meta lost a separate trial that found the tech giant misled consumers about the safety of its platforms and enabled harm, including child sexual exploitation. Meta has also come under scrutiny for admitting to earning billions in revenue from fraudulent ads. This confluence of events has led to a slow-motion reckoning for the advertising industry, which is responsible for providing ever-growing revenue to these big tech companies, even as they are found by juries to be intentionally addicting users, leading to real-world harms. The hand-wringing over tech platforms' shady business practices is certainly not new. We've been having some of these very same conversations for the better part of a decade, and we've been highlighting them on the Media Leader since its launch. But amid the public furor and continued legal backlash, is it possible that this conversation is reaching a crescendo? If so, what should the media and advertising industries be doing about it? Jess Butcher is the founder of ScrollAware, a not-for-profit aiming to raise awareness of the harms of social media addiction to key stakeholders across the ad industry. A former tech entrepreneur, Butcher has become an activist in the fight over online harms. I wanted to sit down with Butcher to hear her perspective. What should business leaders be doing in response to the addiction trial verdict? Should there be a divestiture of ad spend from addictive platforms on moral grounds, on business grounds? Is this not just the latest moral panic? This is our conversation. I hope you enjoy. Jess Butcher, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I normally like to ask our guests how they first got into the media industry, but in this case, I actually wanted to preempt because I've spoken with hundreds of business leaders on this show, and you must have one of the most unique resumes that I've seen. You've worked in your career in marketing for Alibaba, at a number of startups. You yourself founded an augmented reality business, Blipar, in 2011, a peer-to-peer video platform, Tick Done, in 2018. You're one of 4 commissioners of the Equality and Human Rights Commission appointed by Liz Truss, of all people, in 2020. You're an advisor to an app, Sweatcoin, that provides virtual currency in reward for physical activity. And about a year ago, you founded ScrollAware, which is a non-for-profit. Briefly, if you can, take me through this career and how it led you to the most recent founding at ScrollAware.
What a mess, right? I've often joked that my CV says scrappy, can't be managed, and susceptible to unscrupulous recruitment consultants. Still don't know what I want to be when I grow up, is the simple explanation. Entrepreneurship is the theme, I guess, that's run through most of it. I love innovation. I love disruption. And whilst I'm not a techie, I've always been drawn to technology companies, but primarily in the marketing, business development, and partnership side of things. So my role has always been to, I guess, communicate how a particular new idea or new technology will revolutionize its space, and to get as many people as possible excited about that, whether that's the end customer working on the front end of the marketing, whether it's journalists and doing the communication side, whether it's investor relations, or strategic partnerships where you bring lots of people together to take something to market in a much bigger and more impressive way. So a lot of those moves and career decisions came from seeing shiny things and thinking, that's so awesome, I want to be part of that journey. So I guess I was looking for seats on rockets throughout a lot of my career. And some of them did really, really well. Some of them didn't do so well. But each one of them has given me learnings and, most importantly, network. So what I've found is I've become quite a good linky brain and dot connector between different industries and different people within industries to network ideas into reality. And the journey, obviously, you've always got your professional journey, and then you've got a personal journey that's always running alongside that, and those two things can intertwine. I guess my most formative years were in the 2010s when I was building Blipper, the augmented reality platform. And that was the journey where the rocket really took off into orbit. So from a pub chat of four of us, we ended up raising $120 million, had apparent unicorn status for a period of time, 10 offices around the world. And for me, at the front end of the business, it literally elevated me onto these platforms all around the world. So speaking on huge conference stages, going out to Silicon Valley quite a lot, and going into the offices of Meta and Google and Uber and, you know, all the hot Silicon Valley disruptors at that time. And brought me into contact with a lot of business leaders because we were actually in ad tech. So I've always kind of moved around the advertising and media space. At Blipper, I was selling to it as a sort of strategic thought leader for how you could meld together the different mediums, you know, how you could turn press and outdoor interactive and connect it to e-commerce and digital sites, because Blipper was effectively offering that interactive digital bridge between all these different formats. So I've always been fascinated by marketing and advertising, doing it at my own companies, but equally selling to that industry and having an appreciation of what the KPIs were, how the funnels worked, who was doing what, and how my clients would attract new adherents to whatever they were selling. So I guess I'm a marketer in a very broad generalist sense. And that was my professional journey at the same time as the personal journey. Obviously, I've been through motherhood, so I've now got 3 children under 12. I was worried and concerned around polarization. This was what cracked open my interest in the attention economy and some of its ramifications, and that was what took me into the equalities role. Because as an independent regulator, government regulator, it was looking at basically the ramifications of incredibly polarized debate around some of the most sensitive issues in the world today, you know, issues around race and disability and sex and gender ideology. And it struck me how many of those hugely important issues were being dictated to by incredibly binary, oversimplistic narratives, you know, that were determined to create battle lines between good and evil. And if you can't see the nuance or the complexity of these issues, then you end up solving for the wrong problems. And that was one of the things that we were trying to tackle at the EHRC, is how can we bring nuance and benefit of the doubt back into these conversations so they were less tribal and we were really getting to the heart of what was happening and what could be done to improve it, rather than these knee-jerk reactions to simplistic problem pointing. So the attention economy I identified as a main culprit for a lot of those challenges.
Knee-jerk reactions online to nuanced issues.
Exactly. Because you solve for the wrong problem if you don't identify it properly. You know, if you assume everything is down to one and only one cause, then you fix for that and you create many others. I think a good example of that would be, you know, the very simplistic binary nature of a lot of the narrative within feminism has, I think, been a driver of what we've seen with the rise of the manosphere. There's
you're blaming women for the rise of the manosphere?
No, I'm not blaming women for it. I'm blaming a very simplistic narrative that devalued a lot of the things that, well, masculinity to a large extent, which has become has only really now got a negative context when there's a lot of beneficent masculinity. And there's a lot of toxic femininity, I should say, as well. But let's not go down that rabbit hole. That one, we could be here for hours if we go down that one.
I'm sure we could have a strong debate, it sounds like, on the subject. But yes, another debate that has cropped up within our industry more recently is to do with social media. And your work as well with ScrollAware, I think, speaks to this a little bit. Whether or not it's safe, healthy, it's something that people should be spending hours of their day on. And that obviously came to a head in March with the social media addiction trial that was decided in the Los Angeles court, which found Meta and Google via YouTube had actually harmfully addicted someone to their platform. I'm curious, first of all, how you viewed that trial, how you received that information when it came down, and then also maybe how it speaks to some of the work that you're doing more generally with the nonprofit.
Those court cases are incredibly important because it's through the legal system that changes mostly happen in the US. We could go down another rabbit hole around Section 230, if you're familiar with that, which is the reason why these technology companies do not take liability for any content within their platforms. This is a very archaic Telecommunications Act from the late 90s, which protects them from liability. But this court case obviously has shown that the design of the platforms themselves are addictive, and that they knew they were, and that they were discussing it internally and decided it's okay to continue to have them be addictive. So the court case will now open the floodgates to many, many others. I mean, it will be appealed, there's no doubt, but it's high profile enough globally that and obviously a lot of the activism that's happened over the last couple of years since the success of Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, has just lit a fire under this conversation. And there's not a day goes by now where there isn't some high-profile news story or a documentary that's launched or a drama or a tragic story of a life lost due to something that's happened online that is just keeping the, I guess, online harms as an issue in the papers daily. And more people are waking up to it. I think this is all a very positive conversation. So this was a trend that I guess I tuned into about four years ago, and started to do a lot of reading and networking with other people that were tuned into it. And there's a lot of sub harms under this umbrella and a huge amount of discussion and conversations to where the solutions might lie. So there's the regulatory question, which is huge. We've got, not just the cases in the US, but obviously a lot of debate over here and indeed globally around bans and age gates for social media for young people. You've then got grassroots movements, and they are cropping up everywhere. So the huge success of smartphone-free childhood here. There's a similar initiative in America called Wait Until Eighth Grade, to give devices. And lots of noise around parenting communities, where I think that's where 90% of the debate is right now around children and harms there. But there are lots of other stakeholders to this. And I guess my starting premise with ScrollAware was, yes, this is huge for children, huge impact on children. But we're not, I don't think, having enough discussion about the impact on broader society and on adults and our behaviours, and on the example that we set to children who will look up and just see adults everywhere around them, in their own home, in the streets around them, in the restaurants, teachers at school, potentially even on devices. And, just consider that to be normal. Plus, where we started on polarization, this is adult behaviours that are being impacted by this, that are creating these, a hugely polarized community, both politically and around issues and social justice. And then you've got all these other negative trends, from the rise of loneliness and the decline of community to the rise of anxiety. They're all related to our content diet. And that content diet has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. And indeed, it's changed hugely in only the last 3 or 4 years. And I don't think the debate has updated accordingly. We still talk about social media, for example. These big tech platforms that are taking the lion's share of our time. It's not social media. It hasn't been social media for quite some time. It's algorithmic short form media. It's ultra-processed content, ultimately. And we're coming, I think, now to a growing acceptance that that sort of content is to the brain in a very similar way that ultra-processed food is to the body. It's designed to sate our worst instincts as humans, whether that's sort of dopamine and silly, stupid sort of brain rot type content, or whether it's rage bait and, outrage-driven content, or whether it's misinformation or disinformation, designed with an agenda in mind. The point is, it's slop for the brain, and it's making us all ill. It's, I think it's damaging. There's two aspects that aren't really discussed enough: the time opportunity cost, so what it extracts from society, which is 14 billion hours a day, which is huge under any measure, and I think negates that whole, is this another moral panic? This isn't. This is something really quite different, in terms of what it's doing to the timetable of humanity and how we live our lives. And the second issue that's, I think, underexplored is what it's doing to our brains as far as concentration and focus is concerned, and all the ramifications that we're seeing, from the massive decline in reading to the extinction of boredom, and time within our own heads to process, to make sense of what we're consuming and the experiences that we're having. And those are really undermining us as a society. They're undermining our cohesion as communities, and they're dumbing us down at a time at which we've never needed our wits and our powers of critical thinking more with the rise of AI.
There's a lot in there.
There is so
unpack,
much, sorry.
But the first one, I like how you sort of put it, is this a moral panic? I think that's a question that gets raised a lot. And I'm glad you brought up The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. It's a book that has been talked about more than maybe any other nonfiction book over the past 2 or 3 years. I should note that it was criticized in a review by the science journal Nature as, quote, not supported by science, and rather Haidt is, quote, telling a scary story about children's development that many parents are primed to believe. That's according to Candace Odgers, who's the Associate Dean for Research at UC Irvine. I think the concern that Odgers and other people have raised around that book in particular, but a lot, I think this debate in general, is that maybe it has been too simplified into people who are hand-wringing over social media versus people that love social media, spend all their time online and think it's not a problem. If the science on social media addiction, apart from maybe the legal stance on addiction, is not necessarily settled in terms of how it's impacting mental health, it's easy to say that people are less happy now and it's because of social media and they're spending too much time online. But those might be correlated rather than causational. How do you respond to those arguments?
Well, unlike a lot of people, I have gone very deep on the data. I know there are scientists that have gone deeper that will say that the science isn't certain. I do believe it's very strong science. I think, unlike many scientists, Jonathan and his team, who I have been fortunate to have met and worked with in full disclosure, they open sourced everything. They invited academics into every single bit that they researched in the run up to the book, and continue to do that and say, tell us where we're wrong, tell us where we're wrong. And so I think the body of evidence is solid and it's backed up increasingly. And I'm working with health professionals for Safer Screens, for example. They're doing a huge amount of work on the impact on sleep and mental health and biology and what's happening within the brain and our cognitive powers. So I don't believe that there is that evidence is in doubt. But ultimately, I defer, as most people do, to the evidence of our own experience, right? What we see in terms of, and at the most obvious level, I defer to my own behaviours. What I now find myself susceptible to. How my own focus has been so dramatically disrupted by how I consume content now, and the fact that when I pick up a newspaper, I struggle to read a long form article because my brain dips around the page and I start at the beginning and then I go to the end of the article.
You're
and then
used
I check
to flipping around on social media. The moment you're bored, you can go to the next video, say.
Exactly.
Sure.
And I know my susceptibility to, I know how the time goes and gets eaten. How I can start with a 10-minute free gap to do some scrolling, and I'm still there 2 hours later. The bedtime scroll especially is just toxic. And if I, as a woman, tuned into this industry in my 40s, struggle to moderate my own behavior around this stuff, this is terrifying for my children, because the stuff they're being fed is bright and it's shiny and it's funny and it's, it just hits them and assaults them, and it is that dopamine. So I observe it in them, I observe it in me, I observe it in the world when I walk around and I see it, and I think that's where this is resonating. Certainly around the parenting conversation, because ask any parent with children around the age group of my children, and they will say this is the biggest source of conflict under the home, under the roof. And they can tell you the difference in their children's behavior after they've just come off a long time on screens versus when they've been outside playing, versus when they've been with their friends, versus when they've been reading or doing anything else. So there's the evidence of our own eyes that which is why I think this is so compelling and why so many people are waking up to it.
I raised the point simply because I have the same anecdotes. I mean, I don't have kids, but I also have experienced waning attention spans that I can recover if I go and read a book or spend some time outside playing sports. However, I need to be careful not to get out ahead of science that is maybe correlative rather than causational. I'm not sure if I've used the scientific terms there, but to say the least, I given that there's a lot of changes coming, and we're going to talk about some of the policy stances that you might have and your organization might have, and that you're maybe lobbying members of the industry to have, I think it's important to understand where the science is and where it's not. I think it's totally fair to make a moral or ethical argument on this basis of, is this how we want to raise our society versus it's necessarily causing addiction or necessarily causing
the
harm.
only thing I would say before we close that conversation off is, in any other sphere of life, the precautionary principle holds. So, we wouldn't allow children access to something until we knew it was safe. When you look at this in food standards and where we've got to, obviously, on drugs and alcohol and age gating of film content, and, you always defer to the safe option first in society and then allow, access thereafter. And we're obviously having to do this back to front. So, that's where, I do have sympathy with a ban from the perspective of, well, let's do it. And then we can reintegrate or reintroduce exposure and content that is of an educational nature or, has entertainment value in a way that is safe, rather than, waiting until the science says categorically, this is bad or this is okay.
Gotcha. Well, I'll ask you about the ban in a moment. First, just on ScrollAware, what's the aim of the nonprofit? What result do you want to drive? And how is it related, I suppose, to business leaders within our own industry?
So our slogan at ScrollAware is less scroll, more soul. And that speaks to the mission. But most critically, we're seeking to be a convener of the conversation for business. And personality, because obviously personality now is business to a certain extent. Talent is business. We live in the cult of personal, the age of personal brand, we should say. So what ScrollAware seeks to do is convene that side of the conversation, which has been remarkably quiet to date. So, there are very few people within the business community that have come out to say, hang on, what does responsibility look like around attention and a lot of the negative byproducts and trends that we're seeing in this area, for obvious reasons, which I'm sure we'll come on to discuss. But the aim of ScrollAware is ultimately to shift the scroll to soul ratio as we see it. So a little less scroll time, a little more soul time. But to do that through the power of a large number of brands and talent coming together to promote a more positive vision for how we can spend our time. So there's a number of different components within that. The first is almost like a sort of lobbying group of leaders that take a seat around the table to say, what does responsibility look like? Ultimately, what does a responsible media buy look like? What should we be doing internally where our people are concerned, who are all overwhelmed and increasingly burnt out and, getting very, very distracted within the workplace? What does responsibility there look like? And then what does responsibility to our consumers look like? And there are, understandably, as you can probably tell by the name, some parallels with the Drink Aware and Gamble Aware campaigns. Can we together work on a public health consistent message campaign, which simply nudges in different moments in people's day for them to take a break, or have a few more boundaries, or just be that little bit more intentional with your time. Look up, have a conversation, just sit with your thoughts and your ideas, play more, embrace boredom, read. It's these little nudges that, I'd love to see appearing in coffee shops occasionally, a no scroll zone table, for example, or in a shop window, or in the bottom left-hand corner of a billboard. So ScrollAware is seeking to build that sort of umbrella public health campaign through the combined reach of multiple brands and high-profile individuals.
Do you want brands to disinvest from companies that are, I guess, addictive, legally speaking? So in this case, Meta and Google, which make most of their money from advertising?
No. And I'd be very clear on that right now. This ScrollAware is not anti-big tech. ScrollAware is pro-intentional tech. And as a tech entrepreneur, I am a huge fan of tech that enables our lives, in any way. It can delight us. It can make our lives easier, more informed. It can bring people together. The distinction in our mind at ScrollAware is between tech that does enable in that way versus tech that seeks to become a destination for our lives. And that is a big distinction. And I think that's the seesaw that has just tipped into the negative. But there is nothing naive about this campaign. I totally understand that every brand, advertiser, media manager needs to put their content where the consumer is. And right now, a lot of them are online, right? Mm-hmm. So, it's baby steps. It's simply saying, well, how is this impacting where we go? How can we have strength in numbers as business leaders to actually be a little bit more assertive when it comes to our conversations with the bigger technology platforms? How can we insist together on brutal transparency as to where our ads sit against what, and how we can protect ourselves from not sitting next to, best case scenario, some sloppy AI, worst case scenario, some, truly heinous
child sexual abuse material. For
awful material. Yeah. Because I think there is a huge problem with transparency in the industry and with platforms effectively marking their own homework. That is also, frankly, reducing the effectiveness of a lot of that media buy as well. And the more I've scratched under the surface of the online advertising industry, the more amazed I am as to why, some of the data that I'm seeing about relative effectiveness on different forms of content and in different sorts of media isn't more talked about.
Well, you certainly write about it a lot on the media.
I know you do, and you're heroes. Because there are some fantastic people writing about this, and you will know about it more than anyone. I mean, it was obviously a lot of people were talking about it post the Meta, the Reuters report last year around fraudulent and spam advertising and this sheer
billions of revenue that Meta's actually admitted to taking in from
and they admitted it on the lead stage, right, at the conference there. And that has woken people up, I think, and woken a lot of people up within the ad world, because there's this sort of growing distaste, but equally powerlessness. That's what I've learned. I've spent a year now talking to brand managers, CMOs, and some of the largest media groups in the world, just asking questions. Where are you on this? And it's utterly fascinating that every conversation starts with them saying, as a human, I'm profoundly worried about this as a parent, as somebody who walks around the world and sees this, but as a professional, don't know, I don't know what we can do. And there's this sense, which I always have to, reassure them of. It's like, we don't want to go up against big tech. It's like, no one's asking you to go up against big tech. These are partner organizations. There have been, and this is where the debate is, right, how much of the byproducts of this were deliberate or not. But there are some incredible people, good people, working at these organizations that genuinely have, the right goals and the right intentions behind what they're doing. And it would be stupid to ignore that or to deny that. So the question is, right, so we both care about the same thing. How can we work together? Perhaps let's explore, let's discuss, let's brainstorm. Can we demonetize the addictive end of scroll, for example? Perhaps we don't want our ads sitting around somebody who's been on for 6 hours a day. Questions like that are what we want to start to encourage. But bringing those leaders together to say, we're not going to crack this overnight, but there will be things that we can do to just advocate for those breaks and boundaries in a slightly healthier way.
You mentioned brand leaders, CMOs, that they're afraid of taking on big tech. They've expressed that too. Why would they be afraid of taking on someone who I would imagine the relationship is meant to be as a business partner? You're a media owner. We can give you money in return for placing an ad, how we would like to show up next to X content and to X or Y audience.
Perhaps fear is the wrong word. Powerlessness might be a
because they aren't
word.
given the transparency over where their spend is going.
That they don't see that there's many other alternatives for that spend. What's that old adage? No one ever gets fired for hiring McKinsey.
Right.
And I think it's quite similar when you pull a media plan together.
No one ever gets fired for buying Facebook is the adage that you hear a lot in this industry.
And I think now the machine of marketing has become so numbers based, metrics based, funnels based, CPMs and CPAs and clicks, and it provides your leadership and your board with something that can say, look what we're doing. We ultimately got X numbers of people through that funnel in one form or another. And because that's become now the convention of how to do marketing, there's an inertia in terms of rocking that boat.
You say inertia. I might say advertisers are happily complicit. Advertisers are wanting to deliver KPIs on behalf of, the rest of their business. A marketing officer wants to see that the numbers going up, that growth is being attributable to this spend. So there's all the reasons sort of that you might need for the pro argument for spending on social platforms. How do you go about talking to some of these CMOs or other marketers and sort of tell them maybe it's not in your best interest to continue advertising in the way that you are?
Well, I think a lot of people are coming to that revelation by themselves, because the effectiveness of the platforms is going down massively. And I think the more evidence there is of fraud and bot farms and, the shadow banning and all the different things that are going on in the background, the more, the brands themselves are actually saying, is this really working? And you have fabulous marketers like Tom Goodwin, talking about bringing creativity back and, and stopping automating everything and putting humans back in the process and making things feel authentic. And every time there is a fabulous example of a brand doing that, it shifts an industry towards a better direction. And what I've loved seeing is a real renaissance in experiential event marketing, which seems to be coming back with a vengeance now. Mm-hmm. And you can appreciate a lot of people within that space are reaching out to me and saying, look what we're doing, because this is great antidote marketing. It really resonates. It's fun. It's memorable. And that's where ScrollAware wants to position what we're doing. We're not anti anything. We're pro, different ways of doing things, or reminding people and aggregating together the data that says, well, actually, spend in what was deemed more traditional media converts 7 to 8 times better than spend on your average social media platform. So by going to events like, and there was one last year, Advertising Who Cares? Mm-hmm. And there was some fabulous data there about the relative effectiveness of, different forms of marketing. TV continues to perform incredibly well, as does cinema, as does outdoor. And whilst if we look at those data against the declining rates of effectiveness and the average amount of time people are spending on an ad on the other platforms, the business case is made. And I think that's the most important argument that ScrollAware is trying to convene. We're not trying to push a moral and ethical argument. We're trying to push a business case argument by aggregating together as much of the information as we can to say, actually, it makes much more business sense to think more holistically about it's not just a responsible media spend, it's also a more effective media spend, particularly where it can potentially support the in-person lives of your end customer, which of course events do, because they'll provide memories and experiences in some way. There was a fabulous event I was at the weekend by a new company called Earned, and they bring together volunteers, brands with volunteers that go out litter picking or painting a school. But critically, just like ScrollAware, they're not selling it as a worthy, ethical business. They're selling it as a really effective brand and marketing opportunity, because these people that come along and they get freebies, they get free tickets to concerts, they get free croissants and coffee at the River Cafe or whatever it might be. They've created a moment and experience that is so memorable for those people, that brings people together in communities. That's the future of marketing and advertising, I think. And so I would love ScrollAware to actually serve as a sort of incubator and signposter for a lot of really cool stuff. And in particular, born and bred in the UK, let's get some, what's the word now? Digital sovereignty is what the government's talking about a lot. And there's some amazing platforms being built in, particularly in university towns. They're building all these social apps designed to bring people together socially, to drive them to the running club, to drive them to the debating or whatever it is in person. That's really exciting for, I think, the brand manager to tap into. They just need to know they're there and that they can scale, of course.
Do you find that there's a potential collective action problem when speaking with brands, pushing them, maybe nudging them toward more events? Although I should say, the latest IPA bellwether showed double-digit growth in businesses wanting to advertise in events more. So positive movement, perhaps, to add to your anecdotes. But generally speaking, most of the social media platforms make their money from small and medium-sized businesses. For all of the great marketeers out there that some of them you've listed, I could point to dozens of excellent media strategists that would probably say something similar in terms of an effectiveness argument. There's also, Joe, who runs the one-man marketing department for his small business out in the country. And for him, maybe it was a Google sales rep, maybe it was a Meta sales rep. Someone got to him early and showed him how he could grow his business this way. And that's the case for, millions of businesses around the world. How do you talk to them about this issue, if you can even reach them?
Yeah, this is a challenge. Obviously, it's the one thing the platforms have done so well is monetize and automate the long tail. And, for many small businesses, there's very little alternative than to put yourself in those platforms, particularly now organic reach is so challenging. And this is one thing that worries me. I'm great friends with Simon Squibb, who's the Help Bank entrepreneur who does the Vox boxing, trying to get everyone online, selling, starting a new business and using these platforms. And it's a really empowering narrative. There's no question. And it does level the playing field. Also, or it did, I guess, this is my point. It did level the playing field for anybody who wanted to just innovate and start up a business. I think what's worrying now is we've kind of reached the really icky end of content creation, and there's just now a tsunami of AI content hitting these platforms. And it's really, I think there was a report this weekend about how, some of the big VCs are actually funding some of these farms. And there was some Buddhist monk that had a fake AI Buddhist monk that's giving all this life advice and had something like 20 million followers within 3 months. And this was a huge sort of bot AI generated business that is now creating all of these digital influencers.
Buddhist monk influencers.
A Buddhist monk influencer. And he
irony.
didn't exist. He didn't exist.
Right.
And part of me is like, utterly fascinated. And then a part of me thinks, Christ, how are these small business owners supposed to cut through with their products anymore? But I have faith in innovation that entrepreneurs will come into the gap. And ultimately, this has been, as an entrepreneur, this has been something that has saddened me is, the sheer success of these platforms has, stifled innovation because it's so hard for anyone to cut through. I know because I tried. You mentioned my video platform, Tick Done, which we launched 3 months before TikTok was a thing.
Right, yeah. So the branding...
The branding wasn't great, although it was kind of embarrassing because people used to see TikTok and go, "Oh, Jess, that's you, isn't it?" And I was like, "No, I wish it was me." I know, gutted. It's very, very hard to launch a direct-to-consumer platform of that kind. So, yeah, I mean, the long tail is going to be very hard to go after anytime soon. But I do think that the big advertisers, they are a very significant proportion of the revenue of these platforms. And they have more responsibility, actually, to have to act in a way that, isn't, does no harm to consumers and to society. They have shareholders. They have that CSR and ESG commitment that they make. And this needs to be on that commitment.
So what would you like to see business leaders push for in terms of changes? Whether they're policy changes, whether they're just individual relationship changes that they might have with a given platform. What are some recommendations that you think should be considered?
Well, first, it's about coming to the table and actually openly having that conversation. We have a lot of ideas as ScrollAware of different initiatives and conversations that we want to drive. The most important one is to have the debate. What does a responsible media buy look like? I think that's the most important conversation. And within that, we have to ask hard questions of ourselves as to, do we have any responsibility for truth, for example, in protecting journalism and journalistic integrity? I'm sure that's an issue you feel quite strongly in your space, but, we cannot have a functioning democracy without truth. And we're about to lose that. In fact, we have lost that for many demographics who only receive their news and information online. So that would be a conversation. I think the other critical conversation to be had is around overwhelm within the workplace. So policies that can be put in place internally. Because remember, a lot of these organizations are some of the biggest employers in the world as well, and there's huge numbers of people that can be positively influenced simply through workplace policies, where we have a really long and hard think about constant ping culture, about availability, online availability at all times, the overwhelm that people have within the workplace. And there's some shocking statistics there. So the average worker will pick up their phone 150 times a day. And they will be spending 25 to 30% of their working hours on non-work related
Scrolling what, like social media platforms during work is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, wow.
I mean, that's the case for the FD to be sat at this table, right? Because if this has been valued at $1 trillion in the US alone, workplace distraction caused by scrolling platforms. It hasn't been sized here because the average, I think that number is averaged in, across so many different things and, cause and effect, as you say. Some of it might be correlation or as opposed to causation, but you see it in burnout, you see it in absenteeism, you see it in mental health issues within the workplace, and you see it when you look across an office, right? So, there's that. And I think, we've got so excited about the Slacks of this world and the Discords and all these different great tools and what they can enable. And largely they're enabling brilliant things, right? But I don't think we've actually gone, hang on a minute. When does the deep work happen? And does that team need to be always available versus that team that's supposed to be building, creating, really, really going deep? That's another really important conversation. And then the third thing is this sort of public health campaigning and having this sort of kite mark that says we care and we're part of the conversation. We're not going to have all the answers overnight. What ScrollAware wants to build is nothing like B Corp. We're not looking at something super onerous and a high, trust mark of look at all these things that we're doing that are brilliant. But it is, we recognize we have responsibility, and there are some minimum things that we are doing, and we are part of the conversation. But ultimately, it's about knowledge sharing and, crowdsourcing from amongst that alliance, really good practice. Who have you worked with that's doing something really cool to help generate communities, or that's got this new advertising model like the Ant example that I gave, or, share, we could do benchmarking, for example, share this, share that. And I'd hope to work very closely with the media agencies, the Omnicoms, Publicis and WPP, to make sure that there's really solid strategy and case studies and data behind all of this.
Pin connecting on a corkboard,
Exactly.
just as you mentioned at the top. I'm going to just list off a couple of policy solutions, and I want you to tell me if you support or disagree with, or I'm sure there's more nuance to it than that. But you mentioned social media ban for under 16s. That's something you support?
Reluctantly. So there's I'm not a fan of bans, but I do support this one for the precautionary principle reasons, and for the signal that it sends that, this sort of algorithmic, addictive, weapons grade behavioral science technology is not safe for children.
Do you worry about data privacy as part of implication, if you have to sort of know who is of a certain age versus who isn't?
I worried about data privacy, but I don't think it's as worrying to me as the net risk of totally unregulated access to social platforms.
Banning infinite scroll as a just design decision.
Banning it? I'm not sure I've heard anyone go that strong and hard on banning it. I think that's one of the softer ways in which we can help young people if we don't bring the ban in. I'd rather that than not have it. I don't believe in too much regulation where adults are concerned. I would lean more libertarian where adults are concerned, but I think we need a lot more education around, what they're doing and why. And I think that cultural shift and pendulum is starting to come back now anyway.
What about requiring that no platform can default to a For You feed when you open an app?
Ooh, I like that.
Okay. I've given you a new idea.
You have. You have.
Is there anything else that you think regulators should be considering?
Yeah, I'm wondering whether there's a couple of ideas that I've been throwing around with some of my champions and advisors. One could be, we talk about climate credits and carbon offsetting. And I really like the idea of some form of attention offsetting. If you extract X amount of attention out of society, there could be a tax or a contribution that I would love to have ring fenced for in community investment, for youth clubs and, places, because not enough people are stating the bleeding obvious, which is you cannot just say to young people, or indeed adults either, just take the devices away and not provide alternatives for that. So, we're working with a lot of organizations that are building incredible blueprints within communities to actually provide alternative spaces and options for not just kids, but adults as well. There's a lot happening within the men's mental health space, which is really, really good. But it's youth clubs and it's parks and it's hobbies. Libraries, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Third spaces. You would like to see in a dream scenario like a tax on specific companies that is then earmarked toward community spaces.
Above what is healthy, and obviously that's a whole debate within itself, what is healthy and how much. But I think there could be some interesting ideas that I would love to explore around, when you hit into that addictive end of scroll, is there, a contribution that, you can tax on that time? I mean, it sounds quite extreme, and this wouldn't be, the whole point of ScrollAware, by the way, is to have a founding council that would make these decisions, not Jess Butcher.
Right.
And I'd love, and that's what I want to happen around the table. Let's throw big, bold ideas around, break them down, talk about why there's no way they would work, but then present our ideas as a panel of smart business people that have thought them through and have, some strength in numbers.
And present them to whom?
Well, big tech and government.
Right.
You know, I think there could be a part lobbying agenda here as well, which I'm quite excited about.
Okay. Finally, next steps then within the next 12 months. I'm sure you like to move quickly as an entrepreneur. What do you want to have accomplished?
So at the moment, we are pulling together our founding council. So we've got some really interesting conversations in play with big media groups, with big brands and some media owners. That founding council will be approximately 10 big organizations, one per different sector that I'd love and I'd hope to be announcing in the summer. And it's that founding council that will come together to think about what the trust mark will look like and put in place some, some bare minimum conditions and criteria that will enable any organization potentially apply to become a ScrollAware organization. So I would love by the autumn to be launching the trust mark, having set those parameters with the founding council. And then towards the end of the year, I would love us to be collaborating on a public health campaign where we'll start to see, these nudges and inspiration appearing in the physical real world at the end of social media reels. Take a break. These sort of very similar to the gamble responsibly, drink responsibly. It's that kind of messaging where we just remind people. Have you had enough yet? Do you want to go out and play?
And I'm sure you'll use best advertising effectiveness practice for
Absolutely.
any of those campaigns.
Yeah.
Jess Butcher, thanks so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Media Leader podcast. Our executive producer is me, Jack Benjamin. Special thanks to our production partner, Trisonic. You can find all our episodes on the podcast platform of your choice or on our website at uk.themedialeader.com. But do please remember to subscribe to be notified of our next episode. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at The Media Leader to receive daily coverage of all the biggest news stories in media and advertising. From all of us at The Media Leader, I'm Jack Benjamin. See you next time.